On the night of the grand event, the millionaire watched in bewilderment as his black housekeeper, previously invisible to his eyes, saved his nephew's life. Upon realizing the value of this ignored woman, his heart wavered, and, when he tried to thank her, his voice failed. In the background, everyone held their breath, waiting for the revelation that would change everything. Welcome to another episode. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you watching from and what time is it there? And if you haven't subscribed yet, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get to the story. The housekeeper adjusted her white uniform before stepping into the long hallway. She checked the collar, smoothed the front, and took a quiet breath. Her shoes squeaked on the polished floor, but she kept moving. She needed to be in the main salon before the guests filled the space. Downstairs, she heard voices. The front doors were open, and some early guests had already arrived. Men in suits and women in gowns spoke in low, polite tones. The staff moved among them, offering drinks and small appetizers. The housekeeper reached the end of the hall and paused behind a carved column. She tried to keep out of everyone's way. A young kitchen attendant bumped into her shoulder. He did not apologize. He just muttered, "Watch it," and hurried on, carrying a tray of glasses. She did not respond. She pressed herself closer to the column and lowered her head. The main salon shone with bright light. Crystal chandeliers hung above rows of chairs and small tables with flower arrangements. Two large windows overlooked the garden. The housekeeper examined the space from a distance. Everything looked perfect. She needed to collect a few silver trays and place them near the buffet at the far end. She moved carefully along the edge of the room, avoiding eye contact. She picked up a tray, then a second one. A tall footman scowled at her as she passed. He whispered, "Hurry up! They're all watching." She nodded and kept going. Outside, the sound of arriving cars filled the driveway. The doorman greeted each guest with a stiff bow. More guests entered. The housekeeper slipped behind a heavy curtain to reach the side corridor. In that corridor, a table held extra napkins, coasters, and utensils. She adjusted a stack of napkins and took a deep breath. The head housekeeper, a stern woman with tight lips, approached. "You," she said to the black housekeeper, "make sure the silver stays polished. Don't let anyone see a single smudge." Her tone was flat. The black housekeeper nodded. She picked up a cloth and rubbed a small spot off a serving spoon. A muffled voice called from the other side of the hall. "Where's the fruit platter?" A waiter rushed by. I have it," he said. The black housekeeper stepped aside, avoiding contact, letting him pass. She carried the trays back to the main salon and placed them quietly. She adjusted a flower in a vase, straightened a chair, and then stood behind a pillar again. The family had not arrived in the room yet. They were probably upstairs, making last-minute preparations. She wondered if the young nephew was in his bedroom, playing quietly. She had seen him earlier in the afternoon, walking alone along the corridor, holding a small toy car. A short, stocky chef passed behind her and grunted, "Move!" She stepped aside without a word. She felt a mild tension along her neck. It had been a long day. She had worked since early morning, ironing tablecloths and dusting shelves. Now the evening was here, and everything needed to be perfect. No one would thank her if it was. They would only notice if she failed. A voice near the entrance grew louder. A middle-aged guest complained, "It's quite warm in here." A servant hurried to adjust the thermostat. Another guest asked for a specific kind of wine. The staff scrambled. The black housekeeper watched from her spot near the corner. She was not part of these interactions. She was just there, holding her breath, waiting for more instructions. The family's patriarch, the millionaire himself, walked in with slow steps. He wore a dark suit and carried himself with a calm, controlled posture. He nodded to a few guests, barely speaking. His gaze swept the room. He glanced over the staff. His eyes passed over the black housekeeper as if she were another piece of furniture. She lowered her head, feeling his distant presence. He moved on, speaking softly to an older relative. In the corridor behind the salon, two maids whispered, "Did you see the guest list? Big names tonight." Another maid replied, They need everything perfect, no mistakes. The black housekeeper stood silent, organizing a stack of linen napkins. She felt their stares sometimes. She knew they talked about her. They rarely included her in anything. They acted as if her skin color made her different, suspicious. She had learned to keep quiet. The music started. A hired quartet began to play at one corner of the salon. A gentle hum of conversation spread among the guests. Waiters offered drinks. Someone laughed softly. The black housekeeper kept her hands busy with small tasks. She adjusted a centerpiece, wiped an invisible speck off a glass, and repositioned a chair. She glanced toward the upstairs hallway. Everything seemed calm so far. Then she smelled something faint. It was barely noticeable. Maybe a hint of something burning. She paused and sniffed the air. It could have been a candle wick or the kitchen stove. She looked around. No one else seemed to notice. She knew it was not her place to cause a fuss. She decided to keep an eye on things. She passed by a footman who was adjusting a curtain. She said softly, "Do you smell something odd?" He frowned at her. "Stop talking nonsense. Do your job." She nodded and stepped back. A guest raised her voice at a waiter. "This champagne is not chilled enough." The waiter rushed back to the kitchen. The black housekeeper decided to circle around to the other side of the salon. On her way, she spotted a small lamp near a floral arrangement. It looked stable, but the cloth around it was slightly off. She reached out and gently moved it, making sure nothing touched the hot surface. The last thing they needed was an accident. She heard quick footsteps. Another servant hissed, "They're announcing dinner soon. Be ready." She responded with a quiet nod. She retreated to the corridor, picked up a stack of fresh napkins, and returned to place them discreetly on a side table. As she did, she caught the nephew's voice upstairs. He was probably talking to someone, but the words were unclear. She hoped the boy was safe in his room, away from the crowd. The music stopped for a moment, then resumed with a new piece. The conversation in the salon grew louder. More guests arrived, greeted by the host with careful politeness. The black housekeeper kept moving, always at the edge of the scene, adjusting, checking, making sure all stayed perfect. She felt a small bead of sweat on her neck. The room was warm, and the tension was high. She could see the fear in some younger staff members' eyes. No one wanted to fail tonight. Everyone needed to maintain this image of perfect order. The smallest problem would bring blame. She braced herself and continued working. A maid bumped into her. "Watch where you're standing," the maid said sharply. The black housekeeper stepped aside without argument. She saw a guest turn to look at them. The guest said nothing, just raised an eyebrow. The black housekeeper pretended she did not notice. She returned to the corridor to fetch more utensils. She saw a faint flicker of light near a corner outlet, like a tiny spark. She rubbed her eyes and checked again. It seemed normal now. Perhaps she was imagining things. She had to stay calm. In the main salon, the family's matriarch entered. She wore a long dress and greeted a few important guests. The staff stiffened. They all knew she demanded perfection. The black housekeeper lowered her head slightly, then continued her tasks. She placed a small bowl of sugared nuts on a side table. She stepped back to observe the room. She watched the footman offer glasses of water. She listened to the quiet hum of the crowd. She studied the angle of the lamps. Everything looked fine. Still, that odd smell lingered. She touched her uniform pocket, feeling a small handkerchief she kept for emergencies. Her heart beat faster, but she did not know why. She sensed something off, but she had no proof. She decided to stay alert. If anything happened, she would have to act quickly. She wondered if she would have the courage to do what was right if trouble came. She took a slow breath and focused on the job. Nothing else mattered now. She stepped closer to the side corridor and leaned near a lamp. She took another careful sniff. The smell of something burning was getting stronger. She reached out and touched the lamp's metal base. It felt warm, maybe too warm. She looked around for someone to report this to. A waiter passed by with a tray of empty glasses. She whispered, "Hey, something smells off over here." He glanced at her, shrugged, and hurried away. She tried again with another staff member, a thin maid who carried folded napkins. "I think there's a wiring problem near the lamp," she said quietly. The maid frowned. "Are you sure? Don't cause trouble," she said, then kept walking. A low, crackling sound drew the housekeeper's attention to a corner behind a draped table. She moved a small decoration aside and saw a faint spark near an outlet. The wires looked old. She knelt down and pressed her ear close. She felt a slight warmth on her face. Her stomach tightened. She knew that if this caught fire, it could spread fast. She stood up and scanned the room. Guests were still talking. The band kept playing. Staff moved in and out, ignoring her. She stepped toward the kitchen to find something to put it out. Maybe water or a fire extinguisher. But the kitchen door was blocked by two waiters arguing over a missing bottle of wine. "Excuse me," she said, trying to squeeze through. "I need to get inside." The first waiter rolled his eyes. "Not now," he said. The second waiter pushed a cart in front of her. She tried to go around, but a cook stepped in, holding a bowl of fruit. She was stuck for a moment. She tapped the waiter's arm. "There's a wiring problem in the salon," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "Talk to the head housekeeper," he said. She bit her lip. The head housekeeper was nowhere in sight. She turned back into the salon and saw a tiny wisp of smoke rising behind that draped table. Her pulse quickened. If she shouted, "Fire!" now, the entire event would collapse into panic. The family would blame her. She had no authority. But if she did nothing, that small spark would become something worse. She took a quick step forward, reached under the tablecloth, and tried to rearrange the wires with a folded napkin. She hoped to keep them from touching anything flammable. Her heart pounded. She heard a faint sizzling sound. A guest noticed her crouching position and frowned. "What are you doing down there?" he asked, stepping closer. She stood up quickly. "Just fixing a tablecloth, sir," she said, forcing a polite tone. He eyed her suspiciously, then walked away, shaking his head. She waited until he left, and then peeked under the table again. The spark was still there, a small orange glow on a wire's end. She backed away and looked toward the stairs. The boy's bedroom was upstairs, near the part of the house above this corner. If a fire started, he might be in danger. She hadn't seen him come down to join the party. She remembered his small, quiet voice. She remembered the sound of his footsteps earlier. She knew someone should check on him. She pressed her lips together and decided to find a bucket of water. She moved quickly back to the corridor. In the corridor, she grabbed a cloth and soaked it in the nearest sink. She returned to the salon and knelt down. She pressed the damp cloth against the hot wire. A tiny spark jumped, and she pulled her hand back. The cloth steamed a bit. She tried again, pushing the cloth to separate the cable from the drapery. She saw a flicker of flame licking the edge of the tablecloth. Her throat tightened. She patted at it, trying to smother it. She managed to snuff it out for the moment, but now she smelled more smoke. She heard a small crack from the wooden floorboard. She realized something under the floor might be catching. Guests still sipped their drinks and talked as if nothing was happening. A distant laugh echoed from a group near the window. She saw the millionaire and his relatives talking in low voices. None of them glanced her way. She tried to meet the eye of another maid. The maid just shook her head and mouthed, "Stop making a scene." The housekeeper felt sweat forming on her forehead. Her hands trembled. If she didn't contain this soon, it would spread. Suddenly, a thin stream of smoke curled upward from beneath the table. She pushed the table aside and saw a small flame at the baseboard. Her heartbeat hammered in her ears. She needed water, more water. But the guests stood right there. If she ran to the kitchen and shouted, everyone would notice. She looked around for a solution and spotted a large vase filled with flowers and water. Without hesitation, she grabbed the vase, pulled out the flowers, and poured the water onto the flame. The water hissed. The flame flickered out. She exhaled slowly. For a few seconds, she thought it was over. Then she smelled the smoke intensifying. The short circuit must have spread inside the wall. Smoke seeped from a gap in the paneling. She heard a faint pop. She stepped back, feeling panic rise. She couldn't handle this alone. She had to warn someone. She turned to a footman nearby. "There's a fire starting in the wall," she said, voice low but urgent. He shook his head. "What are you talking about?" he hissed. "Don't ruin this night." She reached out and grabbed his sleeve. "I'm serious. There's smoke. Look." She pointed at the dark stain on the wall. He followed her gaze and went pale. "Fine," he whispered. "I'll get help. Stay calm." He rushed off, pushing through a small knot of staff. She tried to stay calm, but the guests were still unaware. She saw the millionaire glance over, noticing some commotion, but he did not move. Then a spark erupted behind the wall. A sudden puff of black smoke rose into the room. Someone screamed. A guest shouted, "What's going on?" Another guest stood and backed away, knocking over a chair. The band stopped playing. 2 waiters ran toward the kitchen, yelling for water. The housekeeper pressed herself against the wall, coughing. The smoke burned her throat. She needed to get out of the salon, but she remembered the boy upstairs. If the fire spread, he would be trapped. She pushed through the panicking crowd. Some guests covered their mouths, others shouted instructions. The family tried to restore order, but it was no use. The smoke alarm began to beep. She saw the millionaire step toward the center of the room, calling for calm. She took this chance and slipped out of the salon and headed for the stairs. She took them 2 at a time, coughing as smoke drifted upward. On the 2nd floor, it was quieter. The corridor smelled smoky, but less intense. She rushed toward the nephew's room. She knocked on the door. "Are you inside?" she called. No answer. She tried the handle. Locked. She heard a faint whimper. The boy must be inside. She had to get him out. She looked around for something to break the lock. There was nothing handy. She tried the handle again, rattling it. "Open the door," she shouted. "It's not safe." She heard a muffled sob. The boy must be scared. She ran back to a small storage closet nearby. She grabbed a heavy candlestick holder and returned to the door. She struck the doorknob. It took 3 tries, but finally it loosened, and she shoved the door open. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by a bedside lamp. The boy sat on the bed, eyes red, clinging to a pillow. "Come with me," she said, stepping forward, coughing slightly. He stayed still, shaking his head. "I'm scared," he said. She moved closer and held out her hand. "We have to leave now," she said. She took the blanket from his bed and dipped a corner of it into a small basin of water near his washstand. She placed it over his head to protect him from smoke. She guided him toward the door. The corridor was getting hazy. She coughed again and tried to keep her eyes open. She lifted the boy and held him close, supporting his weight. He wrapped his arms around her neck. She stepped into the hallway, heading back toward the staircase. The smoke was thicker now. She could hear voices shouting below. She pressed forward, her steps careful but quick. She had no time to waste. She felt her eyes burn, her lungs ache. She considered if there was another way down. Probably not. The main staircase was her best option. She tightened her grip on the boy and hurried downward, hoping that someone was clearing a path. She reached the top of the stairs and paused, listening. More shouting, the crackle of flames, the smell of smoke. She leaned forward, adjusting the boy's weight, and prepared to descend. They had to get out, and fast. She started down the steps with the boy in her arms. The smoke thickened, and she coughed hard. She held the boy closer. He buried his face in the damp blanket, whimpering. She saw flames flickering along one wall in the hallway below. She leaned over the banister. The main salon was filled with dark smoke. People were shouting. A guest yelled, "Where's the exit?" Another guest stumbled over a chair. A waiter coughed and tried to lead a small group toward the front door. She spotted a side corridor to her left, clearer than the center of the salon. She decided to use that route. She shifted the boy's weight and stepped onto the next stair. Her legs felt shaky. The heat rose upward, making her skin sweat. The boy coughed softly. She whispered, "We're almost out." She knew he could barely hear her, but she said it anyway. Halfway down, a wooden beam along the ceiling cracked and dropped a spray of sparks. She shielded the boy's head with her arm. She gritted her teeth and kept moving. She reached the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The guests clustered near the main doors, pushing, shouting, and ignoring instructions from the staff. The smoke alarm beeped non-stop. The band members huddled near their instruments, unsure what to do. A tall footman spotted her and shouted, "Over here! Give me the boy!" She shook her head. She did not trust him. She needed to find a clear path out. She noticed a firefighter's voice from outside calling, "Clear the entrance!" She moved toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. The kitchen had a back door that might be less crowded. The floor creaked under her feet. The boy stirred, trying to peek out. She kept the damp cloth over his face. The smoke stung her eyes, and tears ran down her cheeks. She wiped them with her shoulder. She turned right, passing a small table with broken glasses scattered on it. She stepped carefully over them. Behind her, someone cried out, "I can't breathe!" Another voice pleaded, "Open a window!" She reached the kitchen door and kicked it open with her foot. Inside, the kitchen was in chaos. Pots lay scattered. A cook coughed, leaning against a counter. Two waiters knelt by a sink, soaking towels. She raised her voice. "We need the back door!" One waiter looked up and pointed. "That way." She crossed the kitchen, still holding the boy. She saw flames licking the edges of a window frame. The fire was spreading fast. She hurried past the stoves and reached the back entrance. She lowered her shoulder and pushed against the heavy door. It opened to a small courtyard. Fresh air hit her face. She gasped. The boy coughed and cried softly. Outside, a firefighter rushed to her side. "Is he hurt?" the firefighter asked, helping her steady the boy. She shook her head, coughing. "I don't think so." He inhaled smoke. The firefighter lifted the boy from her arms. The boy clung to her hand, but she nodded. "Go," she said to the boy, her voice raw. He looked at her, eyes wide. "You're safe," she said. The firefighter carried him away to a medic waiting near the garden gate. She leaned against the wall. Her lungs burned. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Behind her, thick smoke billowed from the house. The sound of crackling wood grew louder. Another firefighter rushed past her, hose in hand. She heard sirens from the street. She saw a line of people emerging from the main entrance, coughing and stumbling. The staff guided guests away from the building, keeping them at a safe distance. She turned and saw the millionaire at the doorway of the main salon, his face pale, watching the chaos. He spotted her standing in the courtyard. He seemed surprised to see her outside and unharmed. He walked slowly toward her, stepping over fallen debris. He looked at her uniform, stained and damp. He looked into her eyes. He parted his lips as if to speak, but no words came out. He tried again. But he stopped. He stared at her, his throat tight. She noticed his trembling hand. He wanted to say something. She waited, still coughing a bit. A moment later, the medic brought the boy to them. The boy ran to the housekeeper and hugged her waist, crying into her uniform. The millionaire's eyes widened, realizing what she had done. He knew she had gone into the smoke, taken risks, and saved his nephew. He tried again to speak. "Thank you." But his voice cracked. He pressed his lips together and looked at the ground. He seemed unable to form a proper sentence. She held the boy's hand, patting it gently, making sure he felt safe. Around them, firefighters battled the flames. Water sprayed across windows and doors. Smoke poured from the roof. Guests stood in small groups on the lawn, whispering, coughing, pointing at the house. Servants took count of who was safe. Some members of the family stood near the driveway, their faces grim, their clothes soot-stained. They avoided looking at the housekeeper, unsure how to react. The boy's parents rushed over. They grabbed him from the housekeeper's side, hugging him tightly. The father nodded at the housekeeper, clearing his throat. "You saved him," he said quietly. She nodded once, not smiling, not crying. She was too exhausted. Her throat hurt. She felt her knees shake a little. but she stayed upright. The millionaire stepped forward again. He cleared his throat. He said, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. She met his gaze, blinking smoke from her eyes. She knew he wanted to thank her. She knew he wanted to say something meaningful. He struggled. I appreciate what you did, he managed to say, his voice uneven. She nodded and said nothing. She did not need his praise right now. She just wanted to breathe clean air. She turned slightly, looking at the firefighters who moved in and out of the house. The boy clung to his father's leg, watching her quietly. He looked safe now, no longer trapped. A few servants appeared nearby, staring. One of them, the tall footman, looked ashamed. He cleared his throat, but did not approach. Another staff member, a maid, folded her arms and looked at the ground, unsure what to say. The head housekeeper hovered in the background, wringing her hands. No one knew how to address this sudden heroism. The millionaire took a step closer. "We owe you," he said quietly, though his voice lacked its usual authority. She glanced at him. He looked uncomfortable, as if he had stepped out of his own skin. She felt strange too. She had never stood face to face with him in such a situation. Before tonight, he had barely acknowledged her existence. Now he stood here, struggling with words, and she stood here, covered in soot, her lungs burning. The guests on the lawn watched this scene with curiosity. One of them whispered, "That's the housekeeper who saved the boy." Another nodded. "I heard she ran through the smoke." A few tried to approach, but the family members waved them off. They wanted privacy. The firefighters announced that they had contained most of the flames. The damage was serious but not total. The front of the house still stood, though blackened by smoke. The guests began to disperse, some heading to their cars, others waiting for instructions. The staff tried to restore order, but it was impossible. The night was ruined. The planned event had turned into a disaster. The millionaire looked around, then back at the housekeeper. He tried again. "If you need anything." He stopped, closed his mouth, and shook his head. He seemed lost. She stood still, letting her breathing calm down. The boy's mother brushed the child's hair and studied the housekeeper, then said, "You saved him. We're grateful." The housekeeper nodded. She understood their words, but she also knew that gratitude here felt stiff and awkward. A firefighter tapped the millionaire's shoulder, asking questions about the building's wiring and layout. The millionaire turned to answer, giving the housekeeper a moment of reprieve. She took a step back, away from the family. She wanted to find a quiet spot to recover. She wanted to clear her throat and drink some water. She saw a small water station near a parked ambulance and headed that way. She did not look back. The next morning, she woke up early in her small room at the back of the mansion. Her throat felt raw, and her muscles ached from the previous night. She moved slowly, rinsing her face at a tiny sink. Outside her door, the hallway was quiet. No one called her name. No one shouted orders. She opened the door and stepped out, expecting to find someone telling her what to do. Instead, a younger maid stood there, watching her. The maid's eyes were uncertain. "Good morning," the maid said softly. The housekeeper nodded and kept walking. She passed a footman who lowered his gaze when their eyes met. He looked embarrassed. Another staff member approached. "They're talking about you," he said in a low voice. She shrugged, not knowing what to say, and continued toward the main part of the house. The hallway smelled like charred wood. The salon's doors were closed, but a smoky odor drifted through the corridors. She heard a muffled sound of voices outside. She reached a window and looked down at the driveway. 2 reporters stood at the gate, holding microphones. A guard tried to send them away. She heard them asking for an interview with the heroic housekeeper. She stepped back from the window and swallowed hard. In the kitchen, a cook stirred a pot of porridge, coughing occasionally. He saw her and nodded. "We got a mention in the paper," he said quietly. "They wrote about you." She did not reply. She picked up a cloth and wiped a counter that was already clean. She felt everyone's eyes on her, but no one was sure how to act. She went to the pantry and sorted utensils for a while. Her hands shook slightly, so she took a deep breath and slowed her movements. A butler entered. He cleared his throat. "The family is discussing how to handle the press," he said, looking at her. "They might want you to stay out of sight for a bit." She paused, holding a spoon. "Out of sight?" she asked. "Yes," he said, adjusting his tie. "They're grateful, but they don't want a media circus. They say it's for your protection." She nodded slowly, understanding that they did not want the outside world to know too much about her. She understood the hidden message. A gardener stuck his head in the kitchen door. "Fire department is still investigating," he said. The cook nodded. The housekeeper listened. She knew the investigators would want to know how the fire started. She wondered if anyone would mention her early warning signs. Probably not. She decided it didn't matter now. She was just glad the boy was safe. She stepped into the corridor toward the servants' dining area. A small group of staff members stood there, whispering. When she entered, they stopped talking. One of them, a maid, said quietly, "People know what you did." Another nodded. "We all saw you bring the boy out." They did not praise her, they just sounded astonished. She said nothing and picked up a broom, pretending to be busy. They watched her for a moment, then drifted away, unsure how to behave. Around noon, the millionaire's nephew was taken to a doctor in town, just for a checkup. The parents hovered near the main entrance, worrying about reporters. The millionaire himself stayed in his study, behind a closed door. The housekeeper passed by once and heard voices inside, probably relatives arguing about how to handle the situation. She heard words like public image and reputation. She kept walking, holding a tray, as if everything were normal. In the afternoon, the head housekeeper approached her near the laundry room. The head housekeeper's voice was tense. "They are considering a bonus for you," she said, looking at her shoes. "Don't mention it to anyone yet." The black housekeeper nodded. "I didn't ask for it," she said simply. The head housekeeper nodded, uncomfortable. "Of course not," she said. "It's just, well, they feel obliged." She shrugged and left. A little later, she went outside to the back courtyard. The burned smell was still in the air. She saw a few boards and broken pieces of furniture piled against a wall. A handyman sorted through charred scraps. She inhaled slowly, feeling her lungs protest. She thought about the boy, safe in town, and felt a calm relief. She had done what she had to do. No more, no less. A footman stepped outside. He looked nervous. "Some reporters are asking for your name," he said. "I told them I didn't know." She nodded. "Do what you must," she replied, not offering more. He hesitated. "Look," he said quietly, "I'm sorry I ignored you before. You tried to warn us." She studied his face. He looked genuinely ashamed. She just nodded. "We were all busy," she said. He opened his mouth to say more, but then closed it and went back inside. She decided to return to her small room. On the way, she ran into a maid carrying linens. The maid lowered her voice. "They can't pretend you're invisible now," she said, trying to sound friendly. The housekeeper shrugged. "Does it matter?" she asked. The maid looked confused. "I guess it should," she said. "You're the one who saved the kid." The housekeeper just walked on. In the servants' quarters, some were talking about the newspaper article that briefly mentioned her. "They called her the unknown housekeeper who rescued the boy," said one. Another replied, "No names, no details, just a line." They shook their heads. She heard them from behind her closed door. She sat on her small bed and stared at the wall. She felt tired, but not upset. She was still employed. She still had a room, food, and pay. That was enough for now. Later in the day, the millionaire's wife appeared in the service corridor. An unusual occurrence. She stood there, elegant but tense. "May I speak with you?" she asked the housekeeper. The housekeeper stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. The wife studied her face. "We appreciate what you did," she said softly. "The family is grateful. We hope you remain loyal to this household." The housekeeper nodded. "I have always done my work," she said. The wife shifted her weight. Of course, she said. We will ensure you're comfortable. She paused. No interviews, please. The housekeeper nodded again. I understand, she replied. The wife pressed her lips together and returned upstairs. The housekeeper watched her go. She understood the subtext. They wanted her quiet. They wanted no fuss. She would keep doing her tasks. She would dust, polish silver, arrange flowers, and serve quietly. But now everyone knew what happened. She had shown courage, and they could not unsee it. As night approached, the house still smelled of smoke. The event that was supposed to be a grand success had ended in ashes and embarrassment. The staff went about their duties more quietly than usual. The guests had all left. The family kept to themselves, avoiding eye contact with the staff. A few servants shot the housekeeper cautious glances, unsure if they should speak to her or leave her alone. She realized she did not feel as nervous as before. She had done something important. She had made a difference. No one could take that away. Whether they thanked her or not, whether they tried to hide it, she knew the truth. Still, she kept her face neutral. She cleaned where needed, helped where asked, and avoided drawing attention. She would not start acting differently. She would remain calm and steady, doing her job, waiting to see what tomorrow would bring. Late that evening, she retired to her small room again. She washed her hands and folded her uniform neatly for the next day. Outside, the distant sound of a reporter's voice drifted through the window. She heard a guard telling them to leave. She lay down on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. No one would come to praise her now. No one would stand outside her door with thanks. But that was fine. She closed her eyes and rested, ready to face another day under their uncertain gazes. The next day, the house felt uneasy. The lingering smell of smoke mixed with disinfectant. Some damaged sections of the hallway were boarded up. A crew worked quietly, removing charred pieces of wood. Outside, a few reporters still hovered near the gate, hoping for a statement. The housekeeper stepped into the corridor. She wore a clean uniform and carried a small bucket of cleaning supplies. She noticed two other maids whispering near a door. When the maids saw her, they stopped talking and stared. She ignored them and headed for the main salon. That room remained closed for repairs, so she moved on. In the dining room, a footman arranged cutlery under the watchful eye of the butler. The butler saw the housekeeper and nodded. "We will have a family luncheon today. Keep everything in order." She responded quietly, "Yes, sir." The footman avoided her eyes. He looked nervous. She dusted a sideboard, making no comments. A sudden hush fell when the millionaire entered. He paused at the doorway looking around. His eyes landed on the housekeeper. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. He cleared his throat and turned to the butler. "I trust we have no outsiders inside the property?" The butler replied softly, "No, sir. Only the staff and family." The millionaire nodded, then glanced back at the housekeeper for a moment before leaving. The footman whispered to her, "They're jumpy about the press. They don't want anyone talking." She replied with a nod. He added, "The head housekeeper said not to mention the fire." She said, "Understood." She moved on to the next room, polishing a silver tray. She heard voices from the hallway. The millionaire's sister spoke in a low tone. "We must handle this carefully," she said. "We can't have our family name dragged into stories about servants." Another voice, possibly the matriarch, replied, "We must control the narrative." The housekeeper focused on her work, pretending not to hear. Later, the family gathered in a small salon for lunch. The housekeeper served water and bread. She stepped back to the wall, standing quietly. The boy's mother spoke. "I'm still shaken from that night." The father nodded. "We should thank her properly." The matriarch hissed, "Lower your voice." The millionaire sat silently, staring at the tablecloth. A cousin sighed. "People are asking questions. Who is she? They want details." The matriarch replied, "We will say she's a loyal servant who acted on instinct. That's all." The boy sitting at the table looked down, picking at his food. He said nothing. When the meal ended, the family dispersed. The housekeeper cleared the table. The boy lingered, glancing at her, then slipped out of the room. She carried the dishes to the kitchen. Inside, 2 other servants folded linens. One of them said, "They won't let you talk to the press, right?" She answered, "I have no reason to talk to anyone." The servant nodded. "Good, we don't need trouble." While wiping a counter, she noticed the millionaire entering the kitchen. He almost never came in there. He stopped a few steps away and lowered his voice. "Can I speak with you?" he asked. She straightened. "Yes, sir," she said. He looked at the others in the kitchen. "Alone," he added. The servants backed away, leaving them in an uneasy silence. The millionaire cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable. "I wanted to express my gratitude," he said quietly. She waited, standing straight, her arms at her sides. He continued, "You saved my nephew. Without you, he might—" He trailed off. She nodded once. He struggled with his next words. "We appreciate your action," he said, "and we will ensure you're treated fairly." She said nothing. He seemed to expect some response. When she remained quiet, he added, We know the papers are interested. We prefer to handle this quietly. I trust you understand." She nodded again. He shifted his weight. "If you need anything, let the head housekeeper know," he said. Then he turned and walked out, adjusting his jacket collar, as if he had accomplished a difficult task. After he left, the other servants drifted back in. One whispered, "What did he say?" She replied simply, "He thanked me." The servant frowned, expecting more details. "That's it?" She nodded. The servants exchanged looks, unsure what to make of it. Later that afternoon, a messenger arrived with fresh flowers and a note. The head housekeeper intercepted the note and frowned. She called the black housekeeper into a small storage room. "These flowers are for you from the local news editor," she said. "They want an interview." The black housekeeper shook her head. "I'm not interested," she said. The head housekeeper nodded, relieved. "I'll return them," she said. In the pantry, a younger maid approached the housekeeper. "Everyone's talking about you," she said in a nervous tone. "Some say you're a hero, others say you're causing problems." The housekeeper put away some utensils. "I didn't cause the fire," she said calmly. The maid nodded. "I know, but they're unsettled. They're not used to giving credit to someone in your position." The maid looked at the floor, embarrassed. In the late afternoon, the boy wandered into the corridor where the housekeeper was tidying a cabinet. He stood silently, holding a small toy car. She turned and saw him. He looked at her, eyes uncertain. He mumbled, "Thank you." She knelt down. "I'm glad you're safe," she said. He nodded, gripping the toy car. Then he turned and ran off. She stood, thinking nothing more of it, and continued her work. Outside, reporters still waited, calling out questions to anyone who approached the gate. The guards stood firm, refusing entry. A gardener returned from the grounds, muttering, "They want a statement. They want her name." The housekeeper heard this as she passed by. She did not react. In the servants' hall, the staff tried to act normal. They discussed menus, cleaning schedules, and errands, but their voices were subdued. The tension hovered in the air. A few gave the housekeeper side glances. Some nodded at her more politely than before. A few seemed annoyed, as if her heroism disrupted their routine. Before dinner, the matriarch summoned the head housekeeper and the black housekeeper to a small sitting room. The matriarch stood near a window, arms crossed. The millionaire was there too, leaning against a desk, silent. The matriarch spoke first. "We appreciate what you did," she said curtly. "We trust you understand the importance of discretion." The black housekeeper replied, "Yes, ma'am, I understand." The matriarch nodded. "There will be no interviews, no discussions with outsiders," she said. "You will continue your duties as before." She hesitated, then added, "If you have concerns, speak to the head housekeeper." The black housekeeper nodded. "I will do as I always have." The matriarch studied her face. "Good," she said, then opened the door, dismissing them. The head housekeeper left quickly. The black housekeeper turned to go as well, but paused. The millionaire looked at her once more, as if he wanted to say something else. but he remained silent, and she stepped into the hall. That evening, she cleaned the silverware in a quiet corner. A male servant approached, voice low. "Some people think you're special now. They think you have power." She shook her head. "I'm just doing my job," she replied. He sighed. "I know, but things feel different." She did not answer. Upstairs, a door slammed. Someone argued behind closed doors. Perhaps an uncle or a cousin complained about the press. Downstairs, the staff prepared for the next day's tasks. The housekeeper finished polishing a tray and placed it in the cabinet. Her reflection in the silver surface looked calm, steady. She was the same person, doing her work. Yet the atmosphere had changed. She knew this without anyone telling her. At bedtime, she returned to her small room. She changed out of her uniform, folded it, and placed it neatly on a chair. She heard faint voices outside her window. Maybe reporters still lingered. Maybe the neighbors were talking. It didn't matter. She set her alarm for the next morning and lay down, hands folded over her stomach, eyes on the ceiling. She would get up, work, and keep quiet. She would follow orders and maintain her dignity. Nothing else was required. She woke early, as always, and dressed in a clean uniform. She kept her back straight and her hands steady. She walked down the hallway, noticing the scorched marks still visible in some places. The repairs were not finished. The staff worked around them, pretending not to see the damage. In the morning light, the house felt quieter. Fewer reporters stood at the gate. The guards turned them away firmly. Inside, the servants tried to return to a normal routine. The head housekeeper passed by and said, "We must ensure the family breakfast goes smoothly. No delays." The black housekeeper nodded and went to the dining area to check the setup. A maid had already placed plates and cutlery. The footman arranged a pitcher of juice. The black housekeeper adjusted a napkin, making sure it was folded properly. She noticed the footman glance at her. He seemed uncomfortable, perhaps unsure how to treat her now. He said nothing, and she said nothing. When the family entered, the atmosphere was tense. The matriarch took her seat and sipped tea in silence. The millionaire sat quietly, reading a newspaper. The nephew's parents guided the boy to his seat, helping him spread butter on toast. The boy looked at the black housekeeper and gave a small nod, then looked down at his plate. The family's conversation was subdued. They spoke of arrangements to fix the damaged rooms, of upcoming meetings, and of how to handle persistent inquiries from acquaintances. They did not mention the housekeeper or the fire. The black housekeeper refilled a glass of water, then stepped back to her usual place near the wall. After breakfast, the family dispersed. The black housekeeper cleared the table with the others, working silently. She moved through the corridors, wiping dust and adjusting decorations. Now and then, a servant would mutter a greeting or make a vague comment about the weather. It was as if they all tried to pretend nothing had changed, but everyone knew it had. Around midday, the head housekeeper approached her. "The family is planning a small gathering in a few days," she said. "They want everything spotless." The black housekeeper nodded. "I'll make sure the silver is polished," she said. The head housekeeper sighed. "Yes, do that. And the family wants no mention of the incident." She nodded again, unsurprised. Later, as she polished silverware in a narrow room off the kitchen, the millionaire's voice drifted from a nearby corridor. He was speaking with a relative, a cousin, or uncle. "I understand we must appear gracious," he said. "But this cannot become a spectacle. The press is hungry for a story." The relative replied, "We can't deny what happened. The boy was saved by her." The millionaire answered, "Of course, but we control the message." The black housekeeper turned the spoon in her hand, examining its shine. She expected this. She had lived here long enough to know how things worked. She placed the spoon with the others and began polishing a fork. She felt a slight tension in her shoulders but tried to ignore it. In the afternoon, a gardener came inside with a box of flowers. He set them down on a side table and rubbed his hands. "They say the family might give you a reward," he said quietly to the black housekeeper. She shrugged. "I haven't heard anything official." He nodded. "Just rumors," he said. Then he left, carrying pruning shears. Whistling softly, she arranged the flowers in a vase, placing them in the corridor where a guest might see them. As she worked, a maid passed by and stopped. "They're waiting for you to ask for something," the maid said. "They think you'll demand a raise or a better room." The black housekeeper shook her head. "I'm here to work," she said simply. The maid looked puzzled. "But you saved a life," she said. The black housekeeper continued placing flowers. "That was an emergency," she said. "It's done." The maid left, scratching her head, as if she could not understand such an attitude. Later that day, the millionaire himself appeared in the corridor. He stood a short distance away, watching as the black housekeeper dusted a framed painting. She knew he was there but did not turn immediately. After a moment, he cleared his throat. She faced him and lowered her duster. He spoke quietly. "I wanted to know if you're comfortable. Is there anything you need?" She considered his question. "I have what I need, sir," she said. He nodded, looking uncertain. "If you ever feel that, well, if you feel you should speak up, you can talk to the head housekeeper." She nodded. "Yes, sir." He lingered, then said, "I realize I never asked your name." She looked at him steadily. He waited. She told him her name. He repeated it softly, then nodded. "Very well," he said. "I appreciate your discretion." She returned to her dusting. He watched for a second longer, then walked away, his steps echoing in the corridor. After he left, she stood still for a moment, holding the duster. In all the time she had worked here, he had never shown interest in her name. Now he knew it, but did it change anything? She took a small breath and continued her work, dusting the edges of the frame. That evening, as staff gathered for their own meal, a cook mentioned the coming gathering. "They want it to go smoothly, no surprises," the cook said. Another servant nodded. "Probably they'll ignore the fire as if it never happened." A footman stared at his plate. "It happened, though," he said quietly. The cook shrugged. "They want control. That's what matters." The black housekeeper ate quietly, focusing on her plate. She could feel some servants stealing glances at her. A maid asked softly, "Aren't you angry?" The black housekeeper paused, then said simply, "I'm still employed. I have a place to sleep, and I can do my job. That's enough." The maid shook her head, but said nothing more. After dinner, the black housekeeper passed by the boy's room. The door was slightly open. She did not enter, but she heard the boy talking to someone, maybe a tutor or a relative. He said, "She helped me. I was scared." A quiet voice replied, "Yes, but don't bother her. She's busy." The boy said, "I know, but I'm glad she was there." The black housekeeper moved on, not wanting to intrude. In the late evening, she tended to her usual tasks, checking linens, ensuring supplies were in order, and wiping down surfaces. The hallway lights cast long shadows on the floor. She felt the day's tension in her shoulders and neck. She knew that the family and the staff were adjusting to a new reality, one where she was no longer completely invisible. Before going to her room, she passed through the main hall. The repairs were still underway, tools scattered on the floor. She picked up a stray cloth and folded it neatly. A handyman nearby said, "They'll repaint this section tomorrow." She nodded. "I'll avoid this area while they work," she said. He watched her for a moment, then said, "That was something you did, saving that kid." She looked at him. "I did what I had to," she said. He nodded. "Yeah, but still," he replied, then returned to hammering a loose board. She headed to her small room, changed out of her uniform, and sat on her bed. She listened to faint footsteps in the hall. She thought about the millionaire learning her name. She thought about the family's quiet gratitude and their fear of public exposure. She thought about the staff's awkward attempts at conversation. She understood that nothing would be simple now, but she had no intention of demanding anything. She just wanted to do her job with respect. She turned off the small lamp near her bed. Tomorrow would be more of the same. She would continue working. She would clean, arrange, and assist as always. If they chose to see her differently, that was their problem. She had done her part. Now she would maintain her dignity and wait to see if their attitudes changed in any meaningful way. That was all she could do. The next morning, she woke early, dressed neatly, and stepped into the corridor. The house was quieter than before. Some staff spoke in softer tones. She walked toward the breakfast room. On the way, a maid approached. "They need fresh linens upstairs." The housekeeper said calmly, "I'll finish my current task first." The maid looked surprised. Before, the housekeeper would have rushed without question. Now, she stated her limits clearly. The maid hesitated, then nodded. Downstairs, the head housekeeper inspected a row of silver trays. She spotted the black housekeeper and said, "We'll have guests arriving later. Make sure the back hall is spotless." The black housekeeper nodded. "I will, after I deliver the linens." The head housekeeper's eyes narrowed. This was a shift in tone. Yet she gave a short nod and turned away. In the dining area, the black housekeeper placed fresh napkins. A footman said quietly, "You're more direct now." She replied, "I'm just doing my job without rushing to please everyone at once." The footman shrugged. "I guess that's fair." He adjusted a chair and left. The millionaire passed by on his way to the study. He glanced at her. She met his gaze and said, "Good morning." He paused, nodded, and continued. He did not address her by name this time, but there was no coldness in his eyes. She felt more certain of her place. She did not need him to flatter her, only to respect her presence. She climbed the stairs with a stack of linens balanced on her arm. In the corridor, a younger maid said, "I heard you stood up to the head housekeeper's schedule." The black housekeeper answered, "I told her I would finish one task before starting another. That's all." The maid smiled faintly. "I never tried that," she said. The black housekeeper shrugged. "We can do our work well without rushing." The maid nodded, impressed. She delivered the linens and returned downstairs. The morning passed without incidents. No one mocked her. No one ignored her completely. Some staff still seemed uneasy, but they no longer spoke to her as if she were invisible. A cook asked politely if she needed kitchen towels. A gardener asked if it was all right to place new flowers in the corridor before lunch. She answered calmly, "Yes, that's fine." Before midday, the matriarch appeared near the foyer. She inspected the hallway, running a finger over a windowsill. She found no dust. She looked at the black housekeeper and said, "The guests will arrive soon. Keep everything in order." The black housekeeper nodded. The matriarch hesitated, then added, "And don't hesitate to inform the head housekeeper if you need assistance." The black housekeeper said, "I understand." The matriarch turned and walked away. The exchange was brief, but lacked the old tension. In the kitchen, a maid said, "They're treating you differently now." The black housekeeper replied, "I'm doing my work as always." The maid leaned closer. "Yes, but now you don't rush to obey every order instantly. You say what you'll do first." The black housekeeper placed a clean cloth on a tray. "It's basic respect," she said. The maid nodded thoughtfully. A footman walked in, looking nervous. "I have to serve tea in the sitting room soon," he said. "They're picky about the arrangement." The black housekeeper straightened a stack of cups. "Then arrange it properly," she said matter-of-factly. He laughed softly. "Right. Simple enough." He seemed relieved by her calm tone. Before, he might have sneered at her. Now he seemed to value her steady approach. A short while later, she passed the study and heard raised voices inside. Maybe the family argued about the press again. She did not linger or listen. She had tasks to finish. She moved on, adjusting a painting's angle and checking a side table for dust. She heard footsteps behind her. The millionaire's nephew stood there, holding a small book. "Hi," he said softly. She turned. "Hello," she replied. He looked down at his book. "I'm glad you're still here," he said. She nodded. "I work here." He opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure what else to say. After a moment, he ran off. She returned to her tasks, unbothered. Later, in the afternoon, the head housekeeper told her, "We'll need extra help in the dining room before dinner." The black housekeeper set down a cloth. "I'll finish polishing these glasses, then I can help." The head housekeeper eyed her. This was not a refusal, just a statement of order. The head housekeeper sighed. Fine, just be there when you're done. The black housekeeper nodded, continuing at her pace. There was no tension in her tone, just calm certainty. In the pantry, a maid whispered to another maid, "She's not taking advantage. She's just being normal." The other maid shrugged. Maybe normal is what we lacked. They hushed as the black housekeeper entered, then quickly returned to folding napkins. She could feel a subtle shift in their attitude. They were not all friendly, but the atmosphere felt more measured. By evening, she had kept her promise. She finished the glasses and helped in the dining room. She arranged plates and utensils, aligning them neatly. The footman glanced at her and said softly, "You're good at keeping things steady." She replied, "I do my job well." He nodded. "It's noticeable now. That's all." She just continued placing utensils. When the family gathered for dinner, she stood quietly at her station. She did not avoid their eyes anymore. She met their gazes calmly. They gave small nods or looked away neutrally, but no one openly dismissed her. The nephew's parents seemed more relaxed. The boy ate quietly, sneaking a glance at her once in a while. The millionaire barely spoke. After dinner, she helped clear the table. She moved with efficiency, not rushing, not hesitating. Another maid carried dishes, and they worked smoothly together. The maid said, "This is easier when we stay calm." The black housekeeper nodded. "Yes, it is." Later, in her small room, she removed her uniform and folded it neatly. She sat on the edge of her bed, thinking of the day. She had made no demands, issued no threats. She simply refused to be treated as if she had no say. She felt a slight release in her chest, knowing that from now on, she could keep doing her work without swallowing every slight. It was a quiet change, but it mattered. Outside, footsteps passed in the corridor. Maybe a servant heading to bed. She stretched her shoulders and lay down, preparing for another day. The house was still what it was, but she had found a stable ground. She would keep working, and they would see that she was neither a hero to be idolized nor a servant to be dismissed. She was a worker with a job to do, and she would do it her way. The following morning, the house felt calmer. The repairs continued, but no one panicked. The staff followed their routines, speaking in normal tones. The black housekeeper went to the corridor to check if the flowers needed refreshing. She saw a maid adjusting a vase. The maid nodded politely. "Morning." The black housekeeper nodded back. "Morning." The head housekeeper passed by. "We expect some visitors this afternoon," she said. "Make sure the reception area is neat." The black housekeeper replied, "I will check it after I finish rearranging the hall." The head housekeeper paused, then nodded. "Fine," she said. There was no resentment, only acceptance. A gardener brought in fresh flowers. "Where should I put these?" he asked the black housekeeper. She looked around. "Try that corner table," she said. The gardener smiled. "Good idea." He placed them there, adjusting a leaf. This casual interaction felt normal, without tension. As she polished a side table, the millionaire approached. He cleared his throat. "We have guests who may ask about the incident," he said quietly. "If they do, just refer them to the family. No need to explain anything yourself." She looked at him steadily and nodded. Understood. He seemed relieved by her calm reaction. A relative of the family, an older aunt, arrived before noon. She stepped into the hallway and noticed the black housekeeper. "You must be the one," she said softly, eyeing her. The black housekeeper waited, unsure what tone this would take. The aunt said, "I've heard what you did. I'm glad the boy is safe." The black housekeeper nodded. "I'm glad too." The aunt nodded once more and moved on. It was a quiet acknowledgement, nothing dramatic. In the kitchen, a cook asked, "Do you feel different now?" The black housekeeper shook her head. "I'm just doing my job." The cook shrugged. "I guess that's how it should be." He handed her a clean cloth. "Thanks," she said, taking it. In the early afternoon, the house felt lighter. A maid commented, "We're all just working without that weird tension now." It's easier. The black housekeeper moved a chair into place. Yes, we know our tasks, she said. The maid smiled. I was always afraid of messing up, but now I feel like we can breathe. The black housekeeper nodded. We just do our best, that's all. A short time later, a knock sounded at the front door. A pair of visitors arrived, business associates of the family. The staff guided them into a small reception room. The black housekeeper entered quietly, adjusting a vase of flowers and offering refreshments. One visitor asked, "This house had a fire recently, right?" She replied, "You should ask the family about that, sir." He nodded, seeming satisfied. She had done as requested, staying neutral. When she stepped into the hallway, the millionaire stood by the stairs. He had heard the exchange. He gave a short nod, as if to say, "Good." She continued on her way, no words needed. By late afternoon, the family gathered in the sitting room. The black housekeeper passed by the doorway, listening briefly. The matriarch said, "The staff seems settled now." The millionaire replied, "Yes, the disruption is over." Another family member added, "We can continue as before, but perhaps with more awareness." The black housekeeper did not linger. She kept moving, wiping a small table down the hall. Near the servants' quarters, a younger maid said, "You don't let them push you around anymore. It's nice." The black housekeeper answered, "I never wanted trouble, just respect." The maid nodded, "We see that now." The maid seemed relieved that no big confrontations were required, just a calm insistence on fairness. Later, as evening approached, a footman asked, "Would you mind helping me rearrange the chairs in the dining room?" She looked at her current work, saw that she had time, and said, "Sure, let's do it now." He smiled. "Thank you." They worked together, aligning chairs neatly, speaking in low voices about trivial things. It felt normal. At dinner, the family ate quietly. The nephew's parents seemed calmer. The boy looked at the black housekeeper once and gave a small smile. She nodded, keeping her face neutral. She poured water into a glass, stepped back, and stood at her station. She felt no fear. She knew her role, and she knew her worth. After dinner, as she cleared dishes, the head housekeeper approached with a slight smile. "Good work today," she said. The black housekeeper met her eyes. "Thank you," she replied. The head housekeeper nodded. Perhaps no grand praise, but a simple acknowledgement. It was enough. Before going to her room, the black housekeeper passed by the corridor where the fire had started. The repairs looked nearly complete. The walls were clean, and the smell of paint lingered. The staff had placed new decorations to hide any lingering marks. She ran a hand along the smooth surface. No one would know what had happened here if they were new to the house. She turned and headed back. On the way, she saw the millionaire standing at the far end of the corridor, speaking softly to the matriarch. They did not call her over. She did not expect them to. She was free to continue her routine without drama. In her small room, she changed out of her uniform and sat for a moment. The silence felt comfortable. She had no desire for revenge or special treatment. She had proven herself without meaning to, and now the household accepted her presence on a more equal footing. She would keep working, keep doing her tasks, and keep holding her head up. She turned off the lamp and lay down. Outside her window, distant voices murmured, but not urgently. The world felt balanced. She closed her eyes, ready for another day of steady work and quiet confidence. The next morning, she woke at the usual hour, dressed, and stepped into the corridor. She moved without hesitation, checking the main hall for dust. The repairs from the fire were complete. The paint was dry, the furnishings restored to their proper places. No reporters lingered at the gate. The family had handled whatever questions came their way. She passed by a young maid who smiled shyly. "Morning." The black housekeeper nodded. "Morning." She continued toward the dining room. The footman set the table, his movements calm. He glanced at her. "Everything normal today?" She agreed. "Yes, just another day." In the kitchen, a cook handed her a fresh cloth. "We have a simpler menu today," he said. She nodded and took the cloth. As she folded it, a gardener entered with a handful of fresh flowers. "Where should these go?" he asked. She pointed to a side table near the entrance. He placed them there without a fuss. The family came down for breakfast. They sat quietly, making small talk. The boy behaved normally, nibbling on bread and jam. The parents read a brief newspaper report about some unrelated event in town. The matriarch drank her tea without glaring at the staff. The millionaire tapped his finger on the table as he listened to his relatives. No one mentioned the fire. No one brought up the rescue. Everything fell into a familiar routine, except that the tension was gone. After breakfast, she cleared dishes, stacked them carefully, and wiped the table. A maid helped her, handing over each plate. The maid said softly, "It's smooth now." The black housekeeper nodded. "Yes, we have our work, and we know our place." In the corridor, the head housekeeper approached. "We need to prepare for a small event tomorrow," she said. "Just a few guests. Make sure the silver is polished." The black housekeeper nodded. "I'll do it this afternoon." The head housekeeper accepted this answer without objection. They understood each other now. The millionaire passed by on his way to the study. He glanced at the black housekeeper and gave a quick nod. She nodded back. He did not need to say anything. They understood that her work was valued. She had nothing to prove. She carried a stack of linens upstairs, placing them in a guest room. The room was neat and quiet. She straightened the blankets and checked the pillows. Outside, the hall was silent. She headed back down, thinking only of the next task. In the kitchen, a servant asked, "Did they ever give you a bonus?" She shrugged. "I'm still working here. That's enough." The servant grinned. "I guess so. Stability counts." She nodded and checked a schedule pinned to the wall, planning her next steps. By midday, the day's routine was fully established. The staff moved from task to task. The family handled their affairs. She polished the silver as promised, making sure each piece shone. She placed them in order, not rushing, not pausing. A footman entered, glanced at the silver, and said, "Perfect." She said nothing, just kept working. Later, she passed by a corridor window and saw the gardener trimming hedges outside. The scene looked calm. No reporters, no firefighters, no frantic guests. Inside, the family's voices were steady, discussing ordinary matters. The staff's footsteps were measured. She felt the quiet rhythm of work and order. Before dinner, she double-checked the dining room. Everything was correct. She saw her reflection in a polished surface. She looked the same as always, same uniform, same posture. But now, when she walked through the halls, no one ignored her presence or spoke to her with thinly veiled contempt. They acknowledged her, simply and honestly, as a fellow worker who had proven herself under pressure. At dinner, she stood by her station again. The family ate their meal without drama. The nephew looked at her once, gave a small nod, then returned to his plate. She refilled a glass, adjusted a napkin, and stepped back. No words were needed. After dinner, she cleared the table. A maid helped stack dishes. They moved efficiently. The head housekeeper passed by and said, "Well done." The black housekeeper replied, "Thank you." That was enough. No praise was demanded. No special treatment was expected. That night, as she returned to her small room, she carried no doubts with her. She had acted when it mattered. She had performed her duties before and after that event. She had earned a quiet respect. She lay down, closed her eyes, and thought of nothing in particular. Tomorrow would be more work, more routine, and more simple interactions based on mutual understanding. She needed nothing else. The house was stable, the family was calm, and the staff knew each other's worth. With that, she rested, ready for whatever came next.